Hello everybody, this is Kim Vopny, the Vagina Coach, and I am doing a takeover on the Fit&Well page today. And I wanted to talk all about pelvic health in celebration of International Women's Day. So we're going to get started with a little bit of education as to what the pelvic floor is and what we're actually talking about here. Let me just rearrange my organs. So we've got a pelvis here. This is a female pelvis model. And what we're talking about is the group of muscles that closes off the base of the pelvis. So we have a bony scaffolding of our pelvis, and people with male anatomy also have a pelvis. So this is what it looks like without the muscles. We have our pubic joint at the front. And if I turn this around to the back, we have our sacrum. It's a triangular bone. And at the end of the sacrum, we have our tailbone. So that's another attachment point for the pelvic floor muscles. And now this is the pelvis, the person lying on their back. You can imagine a butt cheek here and a butt cheek here. And if you're sitting right now, if you kind of pry your butt cheek, the fleshy part of your bum away, you should be able to feel two bones one on either side. Those are your sit bones. So this diamond shape here, the pelvic outlet, is closed off by a group of muscles. And that again is here. So here it is lying on the back. This would be the butt cheeks here. And there's the two sit bones, the pubic joint, and the tailbone at the front. And we have openings. So we have our anus, this is our vulva, and we have our vagina and our urethra. And this would be considered the perineal body here. So this group of muscles here it forms the pelvic floor. The pelvic floor is 3 layers of muscles, and we have the first 2 layers, which are primarily responsible for closing openings. So those openings I showed you, we want the ability to close them off so that pee poo fart doesn't leak out of us when we don't want it to. So when we want stuff to come out, when we're sitting on the toilet or in the bathroom, we need those muscles to be able to relax to allow that elimination. And when we don't want them to come out, we want them to be able to stay closed, or at least the opportunity to keep them closed voluntarily so that nothing is coming out when we don't want it to. The third layer is responsible primarily for organ support. So inside here, we have our bladder, our uterus, and our rectum. And our pelvic floor muscles, again, that third layer plays a role in helping keep those organs up in their optimal position. When they start to kind of shift out of their optimal position, it would be called pelvic organ prolapse. And with those other 2 layers, when we have the inability to close off those openings, either we don't close them in time or we don't close them strongly enough, that would be considered incontinence. And we can have urinary incontinence, and we can also have anal or fecal incontinence where it's coming out the other opening. So leaking gas or leaking stool. The pelvic floor is also responsible for pelvic and spinal stability. So because of those attachment points on the base of the spine and on our pelvis, we use that as part of our control mechanisms in our core. And the pelvic floor is also responsible for our sexual response. So sexual satisfaction or lack thereof, the pelvic floor is very intimately involved. So super important jobs, and really we haven't been given a whole heck of a lot of information about the pelvic floor. And it may be sometimes when people are pregnant, they may have been told to go home and do their Kegels. But we need a whole heck of a lot more than that. That's not serving us. And the research even shows that being told or telling somebody to go home and do Kegels is not enough. And most people are doing them, over 50% of people are doing them incorrectly. So we're going to walk through how to do a Kegel exercise today. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about pelvic position. So we talked about the function of organ support and the ability of muscles to close off openings. And those muscles, their ability to do those jobs is hindered when we hold our pelvis in a way that contributes to the muscles either adapting to a very shortened or a more shortened state, or if we're holding it in positions where the muscles start to almost overwork, where they're taking over some of the jobs of other muscles because of the way that we're holding ourselves. So this would be considered a neutral pelvis. So if you're sitting right now, your vulva ideally would be on the surface of your chair, and your 2 hip bones would be in the same plane as your pubic joint. And why that's important is a couple reasons. One, I'm going to turn it this way. Here's the bladder, uterus, rectum. And so the bladder, if you can see, is resting here on the pubic joint. It's like a little bit of like a shelf. We have a bit of support from the bony scaffolding. And the uterus then is resting on top if you still have a uterus. Not everybody does, but that's also another support mechanism for our uterus. And when we spend more time here, which the majority of people do, especially in this past year, we've spent a lot more time at home, a lot more time sitting in front of a computer. And a lot of times people are sitting more tucked. So they're actually sitting with their tailbone underneath them. And sometimes the pressure of the chair is on that tailbone, which can put a lot of strain on those two joints here at the back called the SI joints. If you've ever had low back pain, you probably have heard the term SI joints. It can also put pressure on the tailbone itself. And it also takes out that bony scaffolding for organ support. And what actually can happen as well is the pubic joint and the tailbone, it's like they come a little bit closer together, and the muscles then over time, if we're holding ourselves there all the time, the muscles will adapt to a shortened state and be less likely, have less power available to respond to things like laughing, coughing, sneezing, which can sometimes contribute to leaking. So I also equate it to a bicep curl. So I'm going to have my arm straight out here. When I do a bicep curl, the motion is, so here's at my arm at resting length. So pretend it's down by my side. I'm just using it here to show you. And when I contract, I have this whole full range of motion available to me to generate power. And there's a movement up, like a contraction, and then there's a lengthening or a relaxation. And that same thing applies to the pelvic floor. So when we want our pelvic floor to be at an optimal resting length, and then when it's needed, it goes through a range of motion. So if we voluntarily did that, that's what a Kegel exercise would be, and we're going to do that in a moment. But if we are holding our body in a way that there's more shortening or adaptation to tension in that pelvic floor, part of that range of motion is used up. And that means that when something like a laugh, cough, or sneeze, or a movement increases intra-abdominal pressure, which is part of our control mechanism. We all have it and we all need it. But when it's increased and we then can't manage that increase in pressure, either because, again, we don't close the openings off in time or we don't close strongly enough, then we start to have leaking or potentially the organs can shift out of their position. So we want to be able to hold our pelvis in a way where the muscles are at their optimal resting length rather than sitting tucked or standing tucked and having those muscles overwork and be tired and not be able to generate as much force. So I hope that makes sense. So how we hold ourselves matters. So wherever you're sitting right now, if you put your fingers on your pubic joint, I'm going to turn it sideways, and you want to kind of ask your pubic joint to nod forward. And again, you want the reference point of your vulva on the surface of your chair. And what you should then feel also is if you take your hand around to your low back, you should feel the gentle curve that happens, that occurs and that should be there in the spine. When we sit tucked, we actually start to lose that curve and we start to flatten out the back, our low back. And our butt muscles, our glute muscles, also start to become a little flatter and a little bit more inhibited. So nodding your pubic joint forward and coming into neutral is where we want to live for the majority of the day. It doesn't mean that you can't ever slouch. We absolutely can and we should, but we want to spend the majority of our time in a neutral pelvis. What can help us, like just nodding your pubic joint forward and finding your vulva on your chair and then trying to go around through the day trying to think about, I've got to hold myself in neutral, isn't necessarily functional. Part of the reason why we're there is because other muscles have contributed to this position being our norm. And that could be, again, like our glute muscles, because we've been sitting on them. Maybe our glutes are a bit inhibited. We will often start to hold tension in the posterior part of our pelvic floor. So I'm going to show you a release for that. And the other thing that can pull us back into that tucked position is tight hamstrings. Our hamstrings attach into those sit bones. And when so here's neutral, when the hamstrings start to shorten and tighten, they pull the pelvis into that posterior tilt. So lengthening your hamstrings, even lengthening your calves, spending less time in shoes and more time barefoot can be helpful as well. And checking in with your posture throughout the day and trying to find neutral. And when you do, you might actually, in a few, like sometimes in as little as 30 seconds, you might find your low back aches a little bit. And part of the reason, again, is because it's adapted to that flat state without the curve. And then when we go here, it's adding that curve back in, and it's asking muscles to work that have actually really liked being lazy. And then they kind of say, well, but I don't like working. So then they're going to start to kind of talk to you and ask you to slouch again. And you're going to slouch for a little bit, and then you're going to go back to your neutral. And then over time, you start to remind the body where you want it to live. And when you're working on also all the other lengthening, like the hamstrings and the calves, and this exercise I'm going to show you right now, tension starts to release, and the adaptation then is, instead of adapting to a short, tight state, it's starting to unravel that, and eventually we start to come back to that optimal resting length of the muscles. So this is another tip you can try. So here's the pelvis, and again, this would be a pelvis in neutral position from a forward-facing angle. And I want you to grab a tennis ball, or this is a lacrosse ball, a soft lacrosse ball is a good one to start with as well. And you're going to lift up one butt cheek, and you're going to find that sit bone, and then you're going to roll the ball inwards towards the anus. So you're not on the anus and you're not on the bone, you're in that little pocket. And when you do that, so I'm going to do that right now. You can't see my butt, but just pretend, just kind of think you can. So when you have really, really tight muscles and you do that, initially it might feel quite tender, and you're going to kind of, it's almost like you're tipping sideways, and your muscles are going to be a little resistant. So here's the ball, here's your muscles, and they're feeling a little bit uncomfortable. And what you need to do is think about the ball being a strawberry and your muscles being chocolate. And you want to ask your chocolate to melt over the strawberry. And that might take some time depending on how much tension you have. And you can close your eyes, you can bring your awareness to that sit bone and the anus and that space, and you want to imagine that almost like the sit bones are widening, that space is being created. You can think about butter melting, you could think about ice cream softening, you could think about a jellyfish floating, you could think about watching a lava lamp and sort of the flow of the lava, whatever it takes for you to think of softening and releasing tension. And you'll hold it there for maybe 30 seconds or so. And then at the end of that 30 seconds, you take the ball out. And then before you go to the other side, you want to check in and see what has changed. So this side, even in that short period of time, feels more open. It feels lower. It feels wider. It feels like there's more space. And now I'll switch and do the same thing on the other side. And you might notice that one side is tighter than another. And that could be because of how you've sat in a day. It could be how you've held yourself. It could be because of your shoes. It could be because of stress. All sorts of things contribute to us holding more tension in our pelvic floor. Just like for me, I hold all my tension right here. So I'm often cold, or I'm sitting at the computer, and I will usually adapt to holding more tension here. We can hold tension in our pelvic floor just like we can here, and we can develop trigger points, and we benefit from things that will help us release that tension and address trigger points. Okay, so another 30 seconds or so. I take the ball out, and now I'm more balanced and more open. And you can do that exercise a couple times a day, a few times a day. It's a great exercise if you happen to be pregnant. Anytime when we're pregnant, if we can introduce sensations of pressure and discomfort and ask our body to yield to that and soften and surrender, can really help us during birth as well. So this can be for anybody. And just to recap, we want to release tension and release muscles that may have adapted to a shortened state, with the aim of getting them back to their optimal resting length, and then they can have their full range of motion and their full capacity to generate power again. And with regards to Kegel exercises, we're going to go there now. Kegel exercises are a voluntary contract or a close and a lift and then a letting go of the pelvic floor muscles. Dr. Arnold Kegel was the person who designed, or I guess invented, the Kegel exercise. And he was seeing women after giving birth experiencing more challenges with contracting and relaxing their pelvic floor. And he used a biofeedback device called the perineometer, which allowed people to see when they were contracting. So there was a gauge that would move as they contracted and let go as they relaxed. So even if they didn't have the awareness or sensation anymore of being able to do that, with different cueing and visualization, they could then see, even if they couldn't feel what was happening. And then over time, they would start to connect with what was happening, what they were doing to make that happen, and it would help bring back some of that sensation. So that's how a Kegel started. And what's happened over time is it has, again, it's prescribed quite regularly. Like a lot of doctors will, if people come with complaints of incontinence or feeling like they have a weak pelvic floor, the doctor may prescribe Kegels. But very rarely is there an actual assessment of the pelvic floor and an education or teaching of how to do a proper Kegel exercise. So most people go home and they may Google it, or they may say, well, I've heard that you're supposed to stop the flow of urine. And some people will start doing it on the toilet. Doing it on the toilet, it's okay to do once in a blue moon, once for a test. Can I close my opening? Can I stop the flow of urine when it started? That's a test. You won't practice Kegel exercises on the toilet. So that's one misconception. But it's also this elusive thing. It's not a muscle group that we can stand in front of the mirror and, like we can a bicep curl, contract and relax. We can't see what's happening in our pelvic floor. So it's sort of a bit elusive. Now, we could use our own finger and we could insert that into the vagina, and we can see when I do a Kegel, can I feel a gentle hug, and can I feel like a gentle drawing up, and then can I let that go? We could use, if we have a partner, we could use a partner's finger. If we have a male partner, we could use a partner's penis. There are also biofeedback devices on the market. There's an LV, the PeriFit, the Epino. Those are products that could play a role of being able to help us see if we're contracting and relaxing. But the gold standard is to see a women's health physiotherapist or pelvic health physiotherapist and have them perform an assessment on your pelvic floor and have them evaluate your ability to contract and relax. So that's the gold standard. Not everybody has access to that. So again, we have our own biofeedback or potentially a device that could play a role. But if you have an opportunity, I highly, highly, highly recommend seeing a pelvic floor physio. I think they are the most underused women's health resource that we have. The other thing that's happened with Kegel exercises is because the interpretation of, say, incontinence or feeling like you have a weak pelvic floor is that I must be weak and therefore I must need Kegels because I need to get stronger. People associate people associate the challenges that they have with weakness, and that weakness must mean laxity, so therefore I need to build it up with doing strengthening exercises. And a lot of people will buy Kegel weights or jade eggs thinking they need more strength. But again, the benefit of seeing a pelvic health physio can help you determine is if your weakness is a result of laxity or is it a result of overactivity where the muscles are not able to generate as much power because, again, of those tension holding patterns where they don't have as much force capacity left. If it's the latter, if your muscles are actually more prone to being overactive or have adapted to a shortened state, putting a Kegel device in or doing more of the squeezing and lifting of the Kegel exercise will actually potentially contribute to it getting worse. And maybe we need to focus a little bit more on that relaxation. It doesn't mean that we don't benefit from Kegels, but maybe for every contract and lift, we do 3 lengthening breaths, and then we do another activation. So we're going to walk through the steps, but I just wanted to point out that Kegels are interpreted as just a squeeze. Not many people realize there's a lift, and we completely miss out on the thought and the belief that we actually need to let go. Some people gain more strength by learning to relax and release their pelvic floor. So I've given you some releases, and now we're going to talk a little bit about how to do a Kegel exercise. So here is a vulva. For landmarks, these are the labia majora. So these are the lips that have hair. This is the labia minora. So these are the lips without hair. Here's the clitoris under here. So inside here would be the vagina and the urethra. And we're going to use some visualizations here. I want you to sit, and I want you to sit in that neutral pelvis where your vulva would be on the surface of the chair. I'm going to keep the vulva upright because I want to give you some visualization as to what's happening, and I'll turn it up this way a little bit. But I want you to sit, nod your pubic joint forward, have the vulva on the surface of your chair. If you are sitting on a couch or a chair, it could be harder to feel just because it's a little bit cushier. So sitting on a harder surface chair can sometimes be a bit more gives you a bit more sensation or feedback. And what I want you to imagine is that your labia are like lungs. And when we take a breath in, we're going to imagine our lungs and we want our lungs up here to inflate, but we also want our labia to inflate. So you're going to inhale and you're going to expand your ribs sideways. Think of expanding it into your bra strap. There's going to be a little bit of overflow into the belly. So let your belly be soft. You don't have to breathe all the way into your belly, but just allow your belly to be soft and relaxed. And then imagine your labia are like lungs as well, and they're going to fill up with air as you take your breath in. And what should happen is, as sitting on that chair, you should feel like there's a bit of almost like a sense of fullness on the surface of the chair. You can really feel that expansion in your vulva as you take your breath in. And then when you exhale, can you feel like that fullness subsides, like there's a gentle drawing away from the chair? The belly will naturally draw in. You don't have to think about pulling your belly button into your spine. Just feel like the belly has a gentle activation and your ribs will soften. So inhales are all about expansion, expanding the ribs, gentle expansion in the belly, and we're going to imagine our labia are like lungs, or we're going to lengthen or expand our vulva. Okay, so let's do that together. You can even take a hand on your side ribs, either side, and you can have another hand on your belly if you like, and see if you can feel that expansion, and bring your attention again to the surface of your chair and imagine that there's a sense of fullness, or see if you can feel a sense of fullness on the inhale. Okay, so inhales are all about expanding. And now when we exhale, I want you to purse your lips, the lips on your face, and you're going to feel the change. So inhale and expand, purse your lips and blow. And can you feel that there's a heightened awareness of that sort of drawing away from the chair of the vulva, and the belly naturally drawing inwards and the ribs softening? Now we're going to again inhale and expand. Exhale, purse your lips. And now imagine picking up a blueberry with your vagina, and your anus would be down here. Imagine picking up a blueberry and drawing it up into the body as you're exhaling. And then you're going to inhale, and you're going to put that blueberry back down. And then you're going to exhale, pick that blueberry up, pull it up into the body. Inhale, expand, and put that down. So that is essentially a Kegel exercise. And the cue blueberry may work for you, may not work for you. There's no best cue. It's which one resonates most with you and what elicits the response we're looking for. You could also think about a smoothie with a straw, and you're going to sip your smoothie through a straw with your vagina, and then you're going to inhale and you're going to let that go. So you inhale and expand, exhale, sip a smoothie through a straw, and then you're going to inhale and you're going to let that go. You could also imagine that you're a jellyfish, and as you inhale, the jellyfish is softly floating and it's nicely expanded. And then as you exhale, imagine the edges coming together and then the jellyfish propelling up to the surface of the ocean. And then when you inhale, it softly floats, and then you're going to exhale and you're going to propel up to the surface of the ocean. So those are a couple of different cues. You can check out, if you go to YouTube, you can put in core breath, and you can use my name if you want to, Kim Vopni, and that will give you a couple of videos about what we just walked through with a couple of extra cues. And again, there's no best cue, it's the one that's best for you. And when you see a pelvic health physio, which I hope you all take action on and do, you can also test out a couple of those cues with them, and they will also have a couple of cues that they can give to you as well, and it will help you find which one is best for you. And then the final thing about Kegels that I will share is that we need to have a 3C approach. First, we need to do them correctly. So that hopefully will help a little bit with visualization. Ideally, you're going to use a pelvic health physio or some of your own biofeedback to help you ensure you're doing them correctly. Then we need to do them consistently. So Kegels are not a quick fix. We don't do them for 2 weeks and notice a change and then stop and think we're good. It's a lifestyle. It's something that we benefit from doing on a daily basis. And then the final C, so we have correctly, consistently, and then coordinated with movement. And that doesn't mean walking and running, not cardio-based movement, but when we are lifting the laundry basket at home, when we are in the gym and we are doing a workout, we want to think about when are we exerting a force, when are we lifting, pushing, pressing. And then we want to add the core breath, which is what I just taught you, or Kegel exercises, to that exertion. So let's say that bicep curl that we talked about earlier. So pretend my arm is down at the side. I'm just going to hold it out here because, again, you can see it better. So pretend I have a dumbbell in my hand and I'm going to, this is the movement of a bicep curl. The hardest part of a bicep curl when I'm going against gravity is the curl. And then this, the lengthening, is the kind of the relaxation phase. So if I'm going to add the core breath there, what I would do is I would inhale and expand. I would exhale, pick up my blueberries. So I've got my blueberries picked up, and then I curl my arm. And then as I lengthen, I inhale and I let my blueberries go. Exhale, pick up my blueberries, curl my arm, inhale, lengthen my arm and let my blueberries go. So you can take the core breath or Kegels into pretty much any movement and turn it into a core exercise. The pelvic floor is the foundation of our core. So by activating the pelvic floor, we actually are doing a core exercise. I always say Kegels are a core exercise. When we contract and lift the pelvic floor, there is a natural co-contraction of our deep abdominals called the transversus. And that is really what an engaged core is. So when we exhale and purse our lips, we're doing this. And then when we inhale and expand, this happens. Exhale, engage, inhale to expand. Exhale to engage, inhale to expand. So anything really that you add the core breath to can be turned into a core exercise. The ones that I recommend starting with are a pelvic tilt. So you're lying down on your back and you have your knees bent, your feet on the floor, your arms down at your side. And all you do is, so when you're lying down on your back, all you do in a pelvic tilt is you would engage your pelvic floor first. So imagine picking up your blueberries and then you tilt the pelvis backwards. So you kind of flatten out the back and then you inhale and expand and you come back to neutral. Exhale to engage and tilt back. Inhale to expand and release. And the next one would be a bridge exercise. So you're in the same position with the pelvic tilt, except this time instead of tilting the pelvis back and pressing the back into the floor, you keep that neutral pelvis and then you actually lift your pelvis up off the ground so that you're basically lifting your butt away from the floor, and then you inhale and you put that back down. So it takes a little bit of practice, and at the start people always say, well, I feel like I can't feel my Kegel as well when I add in movement, and that's very, very common, and part of the practice is building in that coordination piece. So it's like a bit of a mind-body connection. But over time, it'll become seamless. And then instead of exhaling just before you exert the force, you then exhale as you exert the force. And then eventually you just exhale and the pelvic floor is responding on its own again. So part of the reason we have things like incontinence or organ prolapse or feeling like we have a weak core or back pain, SI joint pain is because the pelvic floor has lost its anticipatory element, meaning it for some reason has lost its ability to contract in anticipation of a movement. So lifting something up, bending over, pushing a door open. So when we add the Kegel just before we exert the force, we're retraining that anticipatory action. And then we exhale as we're doing it. And now it's kind of like the pelvic floor is, okay, I got this. And then eventually we get back to being able to just move and exercise and lift without having to think about picking up blueberries or sipping milkshakes, because the patterning has been retrained and the pelvic floor is now able to respond to the task at hand. So that's our ultimate goal. So just to summarize, seeing a pelvic health physiotherapist is my number one tip that I give to absolutely everybody. If you have access to one, highly, highly, highly recommend you invest that time in seeing a pelvic floor physio, learning how to do a Kegel correctly, and then adding it into movement. And work on the way that you hold your pelvis through the day. So checking in with making sure you're in a neutral pelvis, so you're sitting on your sit bones with your vulva on the surface of the chair as opposed to that tucked under position where you're sitting more on your tailbone. Grab a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball and do a little bit of posterior pelvic floor release. I also have that available on YouTube for you to check out and watch again if you need to. And work on lengthening your hamstrings and your calf muscles, and ideally spending more time barefoot through the day as opposed to being in shoes. So that is pelvic health with the Vagina Coach. I will leave you with that, and I hope you have found that informative. You can find me on Instagram at Vagina Coach if you have any further questions, and I would like to wish you a very happy International Women's Day. Thanks so much for those of you who are watching, and we will see you again. Bye.